If you walk past the Houses of Parliament in London today, you will see him. Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, the symbol of English courage, the hero of the Robin Hood movies, the king who fought for God and glory. We are taught that he was the ultimate knight, a man of honor, a man who respected the code of chivalry. But statues do not speak, and legends do not bleed. If we could tear away the bronze and the stone and look at the man of flesh and blood, we would not find a hero. We would find a warlord who bankrupted his country to fight a war of ego. We would find a man who ordered the cold-blooded elimination of thousands of prisoners. And, most chilling of all, we would find the women. History often focuses on Richard's battles with Saladin, man against man, sword against scimitar. But in the shadow of the Crusade, there was another population, the women of Cyprus, the women of Acre, the women of Jaffa. What happened to them when the lion conquered their cities? Did the code of chivalry protect them, or was honor just a mask for industrial-scaled brutality? Today, we are going to walk through the blood-soaked sands of the Holy Land. We are going to answer the question that Victorian historians tried to bury. When the Lionheart roared, who paid the price? To understand the fate of the women, we must first understand the lie of chivalry. We imagine knights opening doors and protecting damsels. But in the 12th century, chivalry was a class system, not a moral one. If you were a queen or a duchess, Richard might treat you with icy politeness. You were a chess piece, valuable, dangerous. But if you were a commoner, a Saracen, a Jewish woman, or even a Greek Christian peasant, you were not a part of the game. You were the board. You were dirt. Richard the Lionheart was not a monster of passion like Vlad the Impaler. He didn't torture for fun. He was something perhaps more terrifying. He was a monster of pragmatism. He viewed human beings, especially women, as currency. If a woman could be sold, she was loot. If she could be traded, she was a hostage. If she was in the way, she was removed. Before Richard ever set foot in the Holy Land, he unleashed his violence on Christians. In 1191, a storm drove his fleet to Cyprus. The island was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine despot. When Isaac offended Richard, the lion didn't just demand an apology, he launched a full-scale invasion. This is the chapter of the Crusade that often gets skipped. Richard conquered Cyprus with terrifying speed. He wasn't fighting infidels here, he was fighting fellow Christians, and the women of Cyprus paid the price. When Richard's men took the city of Limassol and Nicosia, the laws of war were unleashed. Contemporary chroniclers describe the looting, but they are often vague about the women. They use phrases like despoiled or taken. We must translate this. It meant that the women of Cyprus, Orthodox Christians, were dragged from their homes by Richard's crusaders. They were passed among the soldiers. They were stripped of their jewelry, their dignity, and their freedom. Richard did not stop it. In fact, he profited from it. He taxed the island so heavily that he stripped it bare. The women who were not assaulted were left to starve in a land picked clean by the heroes of the cross. But amidst this carnage, we see Richard's specific treatment of high-value women. He captured Isaac Komnenos's daughter. History simply calls her the damsel of Cyprus.
Here, the chivalry applied. He did not hand her over to the soldiers. He did not put her in chains of iron. He put her in chains of silk. He took this young girl and made her a lady-in-waiting to his own new wife, Berengaria. Think of the psychological perversion of this. This girl watched Richard destroy her father's kingdom. She watched his men pillage her home, and then she was forced to serve the wife of her conqueror. She was forced to smile, to pour wine, to travel with the very army that had ruined her life. She became a living trophy. Richard dragged her all the way to Palestine. She was a reminder to everyone, I possess the bloodline of Cyprus. For Richard, a noblewoman was not a person to be loved or hated. She was an asset to be filed away until needed. Cyprus was just the appetizer. The main course was the Holy Land. In 1191, Richard arrived at the Siege of Acre. The city had been besieged for 2 years. Inside, the Saracen garrison and their families were starving. Outside, the Crusaders were dying of disease. When Richard arrived, the balance shifted. His energy, his money, and his war machines broke the deadlock. On July 12, 1191, Acre surrendered. The surrender terms were specific. The Muslim garrison would be spared if Saladin paid a massive ransom, returned the true cross, and released Christian prisoners. Until the ransom was paid, the garrison and their families were hostages. This is where the story turns dark. Inside Acre, there were not just soldiers, there were thousands of women and children, wives of officers, merchants, servants. When the city gates opened, they walked out into the sunlight, emaciated, holding their babies, hoping for mercy. They looked at the banners of the Lionheart and hoped that a king of such fame would be merciful. They were wrong. Richard was not a patient man. Negotiations with Saladin dragged on. Saladin played for time. He paid part of the ransom, but not all. He delayed. Richard looked at his camp. He had nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children. They needed food. They needed guards. They were slowing him down. He wanted to march on Jerusalem, and he couldn't drag 3,000 hostages with him. So, on August 20th, 1191, Richard made a decision that shocked the world. He didn't sell them. He didn't release them. He ordered them to be brought out to a hill called Iadea in full view of Saladin's outposts. Imagine the scene. The prisoners are bound with ropes. The women are huddled together, trying to shield their children with their bodies. They see the Crusader knights mounting their horses. They see the swords being sharpened. Richard gave the signal. It was not a battle, it was an industrial elimination. The Crusaders moved in. The chronicler Biha ad-Din, who was in Saladin's camp, watched in horror. He wrote, "They were brought out and they were martyred there. No one was spared." The women were not exempted. In the eyes of the Crusaders, these women were Saracens, enemies of Christ. Their humanity was cancelled by their religion. Richard's men moved through the ranks, striking down mothers holding infants. The sands of Iadea turned red. 2,700 to 3,000 people were silenced in a single afternoon. Why? Richard claimed it was punishment for Saladin's delay, but historians know the truth. It was logistics. Dead women don't eat. Dead women don't need guarding. Richard the Lionheart, the hero of chivalry, massacred unarmed women because they were an inconvenience to his march.
But what about the women on his side, the women who followed the crusade? This reveals another layer of Richard's misogyny. Before the fleet sailed, Richard issued strict orders, no women in the camp. He believed that women were a source of sin. He believed they caused the soldiers to gamble, fight, and lose focus on God. He banned wives, he banned lovers. The only exception he made was for good old women to serve as washerwomen and lice pickers. Think about that definition, good old women. To Richard, a woman was only tolerable if she was desexualized, if she was old, invisible, and serving the men by scrubbing their filth. If a woman was young or beautiful, she was a danger. However, during the campaign, this rule broke down. Women followed the army. prostitutes, wives, traders. When Richard took Acre, the discipline of his army collapsed. His soldiers, who had been starved of female company, went wild in the city. Richard was disgusted, not because the women were being mistreated, but because his soldiers were defiling themselves with lust. He tried to purge the camp. He whipped soldiers found with women. He shamed them. He viewed the female body not as a temple, but as a trap, a snare set by the devil to keep him from Jerusalem. We must also look at his own wife, Berengaria of Navarre. She's the only queen of England to never set foot in England. Richard married her in Cyprus, largely for her dowry and political alliance, and then he largely ignored her. She followed his army camp, living in a tent surrounded by the dust and the screams of war. She was a hostage to his ambition. She saw him rarely. There were no children. Rumors have swirled for centuries about Richard's sexuality. Some say he preferred men. Others say he was simply asexual, married only to war. Regardless of the truth, his treatment of Berengaria was cold. She was a political asset he dragged across the desert. When the crusade failed, he sent her home separately. She lived out her life as a widow who had been married to a ghost, a man who loved his sword more than he could ever love a human being. After the massacre at Acre, the war moved south. At the Battle of Jaffa, we see the final grim fate of captive women. When Saladin took Jaffa, before Richard took it back, the town was sacked. When Richard retook it, the cycle repeated. In these skirmishes, women were the currency of exchange. If a crusader captured a high-ranking Saracen woman, he didn't see a person, he saw a ransom check. He would keep her in his tent. If the ransom came, she went home. If it didn't, she was sold to the slave markets of Italy or France. We have records of Saracen women appearing in European households in the 13th century, baptized against their will, renamed, serving as maids in the rainy castles of England, thousands of miles from the sun of Palestine. These were the survivors of Richard's war, women who were swept up by the lion's tail and deposited in a cold, alien world, forced to worship the god of the men who killed their husbands. By late 991, the Third Crusade had stalled. Richard had won battles, but he could not take Jerusalem. He was sick, his men were dying, and he needed a way out. It is here that we see the absolute depth of his cynicism regarding women. He came up with a diplomatic solution that shocked both Christians and Muslims. He didn't offer gold, he offered his own sister.
Joan of England, the former Queen of Sicily, had traveled with him on this crusade. She was a pious Catholic woman, a royal widow. Richard looked at her and saw a bargaining chip. He proposed to Saladin that Joan should marry Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, known to the Crusaders as Safaddin. Think about the implications. Richard, the soldier of Christ, the man who massacred 3,000 prisoners of Acre because they were infidels, was now willing to hand his own sister over to the enemy leader. The plan was that Joan and Al-Adil would rule Jerusalem together, a mixed-faith marriage to end the war. When Joan heard of this plan, she didn't just refuse, she exploded. She was being asked to marry a man she considered a pagan, a man whose armies had killed her friends. She was being asked to leave her culture, her faith, and her people, to live in a harem in Cairo or Damascus. Richard didn't care about her soul. He cared about his legacy. He wanted to say he saved Jerusalem, even if he had to sell his sister to do it. The deal only fell apart because the church intervened and because Joan swore an oath that she would never submit to a Muslim husband. This incident reveals the truth about Richard. He was not a fanatic. He was a transactional narcissist. Women, even royal women, even his own blood, were assets. If the asset could buy peace, he would spend it. If Joan had been less strong, she would have ended her days as a curiosity in an Ayyubid palace, a forgotten footnote in her brother's glorious history. In 1192, Richard finally decided to leave. He signed a treaty with Saladin. He kept the coast, Saladin kept Jerusalem. Richard packed his ships, he took his nobles, he took his gold. But he didn't take everyone. An army attracts a tail, thousands of camp followers, laundresses, cooks, traders, and women who sold their bodies to survive. Many had traveled all the way from England, France, or Italy. When the Lion sailed away, what happened to them? There was no space on the ships for the poor. These women were abandoned in the coastal cities of Acre and Jaffa. They were stranded in a war zone, thousands of miles from home, with no money and no protection. Some managed to marry local settlers, blending into the Poulin, Frankish Syrian society. But many others faced a grimmer fate. Without the protection of the army, they were vulnerable to raids. Many were captured by Muslim slave traders. The irony is bitter. The women who followed the crusade to save their souls often ended up sold into the very world they came to fight. They vanished into the markets of Aleppo and Baghdad, their English names forgotten, their graves unmarked.
So how did this man, who massacred captives, sold women, and abandoned his people, become a hero? We can blame the Victorians. In the 19th century, the British Empire needed symbols. They needed a history that justified imperialism. They needed to believe that English conquest was benevolent and noble. So they dug up Richard. They polished his armor. They ignored the massacres. They ignored the misogyny. They invented Robin Hood stories where Richard returns to bring justice. They built the statue that stands outside Parliament today. But that statue is a lie cast in bronze. The real legacy of Richard's crusade wasn't glory. It was a scar on the Middle East that has never fully healed. And for the women of that era, his legacy was one of silence. The women of Cyprus, starved and pillaged. The women of Acre, beheaded on the hill of Iadea. The women of his own family, used as pawns. The women abandoned on the docks of Jaffa. They are the collateral damage of the great man theory of history. We are taught to look at the crown and ignore the people crushed beneath the throne. Richard I was a man of his time, a time of iron and blood. Perhaps we cannot judge him by modern standards, but we can stop worshiping him. We can stop calling industrial slaughter chivalry. We can stop pretending that a king who viewed women as livestock was a hero of romance. The next time you hear a story about the noble Lionheart, remember the hill of Iadea. Remember the 3,000. Remember the silence. Because true history isn't found in the songs of the victors. It is found in the whispers of the victims. And their verdict is clear. The lion didn't protect the lambs. They ate them.